Wait, let's wait just a minute, one more minute. Was a difficult one, but we managed.
Yeah, I think it was.
Okay, Iwona, I think we should start.
So, do you thought about like a way to start?
Iwona will take care of it.
Shall I introduce?
Yes, I think
Okay.
so.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. The debut, really, of this very remarkable Istanbul Bienali. My name is Iwona Blazwick. I'm director of the Whitechapel Gallery in London, but also count myself very privileged to have known and worked with Carolyn Christov-Bakargiev, the current director of the Istanbul Bienali, since 1993. And in fact, we met a little bit before that at a conference in Greece, in Delphi. And when she spoke, I realized that here was someone who had somehow articulated the zeitgeist exactly as I'd understood it and felt it intuitively, but she put it into words. And from there, I knew I had to meet this woman and share the journey that we've both taken over the last few decades through the world of contemporary art. It's also our great pleasure to be joined here today by Stephen Henry Madoff. And Stephen is at Yale University and is going to preface our discussion with a short paper that he's prepared. And also we're joined by Elvan. How do you pronounce your name? Zabunyan. Forgive me for a contemporary art historian. And I think between us we hope to tease out some of the issues that the theme of the Biennale has raised and put it within the broader context of the contemporary and perhaps the political world today. So, Stephen, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay. So, in fact, what I'd said to Carolyn is that I wanted to tie her remarkable documenta in some ways to what she's done here. And this is a challenge because, of course, I've only been able to read what Carolyn has done, and I've just begun to see it. But I think, as Iwona's just said, we can tease out some of these connections. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read for just about 5 minutes. And I'm calling this radical influence. So, of course, Carolyn's documenta was in 2012, and what was crucial to her there was an idea about art objects as simply things among all other living things, or that's to say that everything is in some sense animated by an internal vital presence, that everything has its own sovereign identity, its own voice interacting with the voices of other things. Not, by the way, a utopian universal chorus, but clashing, harmonizing, falling apart, and coming together kaleidoscopically in relations of violence, hope, imagination, and gravity. And in this radical sense of interconnected presences, both visible and invisible, Carolyn is asking first the radically expanded question of what is thinking, if after all things, not just humans, have a live and sentient being, and then the equally radical question of what is politics, What is the political if we imagine it in the broadest, most imaginative, symbolic, and real ways among all things? And what is a polis, a gathering of consenting and conflicting beings, if it draws from and is a drawing of the network of all living things, what I'd like to call a collective draftsmanship of life and death? Now, Carolyn has repeatedly stated to the press that she doesn't like the word curator, with its implicit implications of power. She prefers the word draftsman or draftsperson, with the double meaning of someone who draws, which is a creative act, and someone who draws the line, who says, enough is enough, which is a political act. Here at the Istanbul Biennial, she's drawing the line using the material metaphors of salt and salt water as things that both corrode and preserve, with a passage of transfer, of negotiation between them, which is also a description of politics and the political. Salt and salt water are these creative and political agents in Carolyn's imagination. And you'll read in the Biennial's catalog that she elaborates on them by talking about different kinds of waves and knots, of flow and arrested movement. But between flow and arrested movement is another condition I'd like you to think about today, and that's the condition of latency, a word used when we talk about digital networks, meaning a signal that's halted or slowed down for a moment, the way a website is slowed down because there's too much traffic or not enough bandwidth on the line. And so by extension, latency suggests a condition of lateness, a seed not yet blossomed, or a resolution not yet reached. In other words, a suspension of time and a promise of something still to come, bad or good. And if time is suspended, then it means that time has no particular direction, but can flow in all directions. It's the possibility of alternative experiences and histories. So we can imagine the victim never becoming a victim, of never going to the death camps, of never being the genocidal subject terminated, of never, or even, I should say, that healing isn't necessary because no one was hurt to begin with. And if salt as a material thing is something that both corrodes and preserves, it's itself a metaphor of time. And salt gives us this sense of being two things at once, of time suspended and accelerated, of the all-decided and the undecided, just as latency is a passage between beginning and ending, of the ontological and eschatological marriage of being. So what I'm saying is that art, as Carolyn presents it here, as she did at Documenta, is about a process of latency, of suspense and suspension in the face of our accelerated digital age, the slow rocking of saltwater waves, because art is always questioning the networks that flow between us and through us, invading the sovereignty of the self, altering it, and sometimes reducing it to what Theodor Adorno called the catastrophe of identity. In fact, a way to frame what Carolyn presents in this biennial is what Adorno called in his book Negative Dialectics, non-identity, by which he meant to fight against the destructiveness of identity as an enforced sameness and the cataclysmic denial of the other. So I'd like to end by saying that at the base of these poetic and political metaphors about salt, about the corrosion of identity and the rejection of sameness, is something else, something related to my summary of this biennial in the phrase, a collective draftsmanship of life and death. And what I mean here is a very special thinking about the idea of influence, which means because, of course, we're essentially talking about how things are changed and affected, how they're transformed poetically and politically. And the word influence comes to us from the Latin influere, in, meaning from or into, and fluere, which means to flow. Influence is a flowing into. And if we dig a little deeper, then a constellation of ancient words about things flowing opens Carolyn's biennial in new relations of languages and things, such as the Greek word hal, meaning sea, and the addition of a single S, of the physical hissing sound of waves in hals, which means salt. Just as we find at the secret center of the Latin verb moriere, to die, the Sanskrit maru, a desert, which means a land of dead earth growing nothing. And when the Romans first looked out on the Mediterranean, they called it mare from maru. The sea is another barren desert, stretching endlessly. And finally, just as there's a special link between influence and salt water, as that word fluere is tied to the two verbs to bite and to see in Sanskrit and Greek, because, of course, the eye sees. And if what the eye sees has a bite to it and stings, well, what do we get? A flow of salt water from the eyes. A flow of tears with its barren sadness that comes from the influence of the outside world on the inside of our understanding, relationships and emotions, society and politics, technology and nature, life and the taking of life. Tears slow us. They make us blink and stop. They create a latency. And what Carolyn presents in Istanbul, titled Saltwater, a Theory of Thought Forms, are thought forms rejecting the idea of enforced sameness and arguing for the sovereignty of individual being and seeing. That these artworks as living things form an agora, a meeting place among the vibrancy of all things in an expanded politics of influence and transformation and survival. We're here to slow down and see. This is the bite of seeing, which isn't only about ruin, but about art's healing ocean of possibility.
Wow.
Perhaps I could, how does one follow that? But it is true that thinking back to other projects beyond documenters, such as the Sydney Biennale, that the way that you identify a theme often marries a physical and a metaphysical concept. So for the Sydney Biennale, the theme was revolutions, forms that turn. So it was both a physical entity or a physical phenomenon and something with a conceptual and a political kind of ethos to it. So could you say something about how that's come to be your sort of modus operandi?
Yes, that's very interesting. First of all, I would like to really compliment you on your visionary ability to speak to an exhibition having seen fragments of it. So that's wonderful. I mean, thank you very much. And also to mention that Iwona is also part of the advisory committee of the Istanbul Biennial. And so I would like to thank her because she was one of the people who actually nominated me for this task. So I take this moment to intercede. When I gave the title, Saltwater, A Theory of Thought Forms, to this project, I did not remember that the Sydney Biennial in 2008 was called Revolutions, Forms That Turn. So the word forms has come up twice in titles to projects, and I suppose that points to what you're asking. When I did Sydney Biennial, the it came to me immediately that the subject would be revolution, because volvere means to turn, revolvere means to turn again. So to turn once and turn again seemed appropriate for a historical period that was just short of Tunisia, just short of Athens, just short of London, of Occupy, so forth. So we're speaking 2007, and I think there was something in the air. It was prior to the catastrophes of the, financial crisis of the fall of that year. And on top of it, I was asked to do something on the so-called antipodes. But it is antipodes, which means the other side, only from the perspective of Europe. Obviously, from an Australian perspective, it's not the antipodes. So this idea that the planet was this ball, you know, that you could turn one way or upside down, and that you could turn it upside down again, is something that is a political gesture of transformation. You can think about the map of Latin America that Torres made of the reversed Latin America, where the sur is the is in the north. And you can think of many other gestures of that sort that have traversed the forming of the notion of the global south. But it also came to me because I was looking at a globe in my daughter's bedroom, and those old things, you know, that they used to have these globes. You could sort of see the world, which of course is a totally arbitrary map in terms of the actual surface of the countries. But I noticed that on the opposite of Herning in Denmark, where Piero Manzoni did his Socle du Monde, which is a base with an upside-down text, Socle du Monde, implying that Herning in 1960 approximately is the base of the world. Suddenly Manzoni had already done that Istanbul Biennial, the Sydney Biennial, in a way he had done that reversal, that revolution forms that turn. So in homage in a way to Piero Manzoni, whose work was essential in that exhibition, I created revolutions forms that turn. Similarly, I think in terms of iconic works that already exist and that I brought into this constellation of latency, as you say, I would say that the Sildo Meirelles painting has functioned in this case. When I saw that work, so it's not a new work for this Biennale, but it was made for an exhibition in Brasilia and then shown once more during a solo exhibition at Luisa Strina in Sao Paulo a couple of years ago. That painting, which hangs there, to be precise, which is southwest. It hangs, and it is actually two paintings combined, and it's called A Hole to Throw Corrupt Politicians In, and there's a little red dot on the bottom of the top half, and then there is a space in between, and the space can vary from 2 centimeters to 3.5 in the instructions of the artist. And I hung it at 3.5, and I hung it at 3, and I hung it at 2, and I hung it at 2.5, and I hung it at 2.8, and I hung it at 2.6, and finally I hung it at 2.7, because it is a very, very special gap. It is a gap, like a fault line, like the Bosphorus. It separates the two parts of the canvas that put them together, and it is a kind of hiatus or jump that somehow in that jump or in that surrealist space lies the possibility, at least mental, imaginary, and the projection, the leap that needs to be made by the viewer to connect that red dot with the red going down into the core of the magma of the earth. And we all live on this very small crust of the earth between the universe above and the core below. It's a very, very small crust. So that has something to do with thought forms and how basically all artworks for me are thought forms. Thought form is a term coined by Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater for a book that they published in 1905 to speak about, let's say, the embodied manifestation of what normally is invisible to most. but it is not invisible. I mean, if one is in a state of deep meditation, or if you take LSD, the trees will move, and they will become like all sorts of things. But for that to happen, it's not because it doesn't happen without deep meditation or LSD. It is because it happens, but you don't notice it. You know, it's the small, vibrant movements, the small breathing of the leaves. I come from arte povera, we must not forget. So this making visible the invisible, which is a task that is a task of exercising perception and so forth, seemed very important in this particular play on words or form. Also because I see a connection between that period of Annie Besant, the period that, for example, Beatriz Colomina is studying for her next book, of the late 1800s and early 1900s, when there was a fascination for what is normally invisible. And we are talking of parallel with, X-rays and the birth of photography and film and so forth, which somehow also it both feeds into and counteracts the notion of progress as it was developing. And this fascination for the invisible comes at the time of technologies of communication, cables going under the oceans for telex and so forth, and and Art Nouveau, in opposition to classical architecture of Haussmann and so forth, and our period, which is also similarly traversed by cables going under the oceans, except that they're carrying the internet and they snap with underwater rivers, so we better study what underwater rivers are. And there you go to this bioarchitecture and bioagriculture. That's why there are the drawings of Patrick Blanc in the channel, and that's why Émile Gallet is with Patrick Blanc, and so forth and so forth. So within this thought form, which is this one, the Bosphorus and the salt water, are somehow entangled all of these things. I would like to say that what you mentioned, one last point, about the, I don't know what you called it, the catastrophe. I mean, Adorno is one of my favorite authors. I grew up, it's bread and butter, and it's so important. Adorno, qualified by Donna Haraway, Judith Butler, and the feminists, Hannah Arendt, and so forth. However, catastrophe is a word I use a lot. My team laughs about it, that I keep saying, it's a catastrophe, and then it's not. But I do think a lot about this question of empathy and a kind of Melanie Klein idea about art as reparation and healing. That's very important for me. And the only thing I would maybe have a question about in your text is that I never say that it is as if one has never been hurt. I never want to make an exhibition like Qu'ils mangent des croissants, Marie Antoinette saying, well, if they don't have bread, qu'ils mangent des croissants. No. So I don't think that it can be as if no one has ever been hurt. That's not possible. And yet, it's a question of a holding environment. It's like a holding environment. It's constantly understanding that a compost is indeed a composting of dead, inert, useless materials that, thank God, flourish and turn into, flourish and turn into all of that. And I think asking Elvan to write for our catalog was a way of bringing that the troubled waters in.
Elvan, you were presumably writing before you could see any work, because there's a lot of site-specific or new works made for this amazing project. How did you approach your writing?
First I will just say çok teşekkürler bu davet için ve Carolyn'e ve İKSV'nin ekibine. I would like to thank Carolyn for this invitation, first also to be here and to be able to discuss. And then for the catalog, actually it was very interesting, and it was part of our, in Turkish, I mean, we speak in English now, and it's very interesting that you were also going back to etymology, but in Turkey the words are not the same, so it's always, and in the translation of conversation in Turkish is Sohbet. This is what is written on the program. And Sohbet it's kind of a light conversation, and we enter a very like deep series or more heavy series. So I wanted to also to have this idea of the dialogue, which was very and the first time we met with Carolyn was very interesting because she was asking a lot of questions. And then this is also part of the process. I think the working process is also to ask questions. And then she said, I would like you to write for the catalog. I said, but on what? So on whatever you want. So this was kind of to have this kind of freedom is always difficult. And as as I wanted to fit with what is going on in the like very violent news linked to the migrants and to all these people dying in exile in the sea, the salt water was kind of a bloody water as well. So I have friends in France. They stopped eating fish, for example. They don't eat fish anymore. So this is part of. It's a Senegalese friend, and he stopped eating fish for the last 6 months. And then actually, when you mentioned the site specific, for me it was very interesting to be also part of this conversation, Sohbet, because it is also a process. You mentioned the organic process, and what I was very interesting in your way to work was how you meet the artist, how the meeting with the artist produce a kind of work. And then I was very interesting, you mentioned the documenta of what Carolyn could feel or experience in the contact with the artist. And mainly with an artist as Siasta Gates, who is also part of the Istanbul Biennale, and actually the site specificity of his work, and this is like the only work I have seen for the moment. So I would like to make the link with that. What I was very interested also is like for the first time, the Istanbul Biennale has so many venues, like 35 venues. So it is part of, I mean, there is very like a 3 days program to try to find our ways, which is almost impossible in a city as Istanbul. I mean, even a month would not be enough. But this is also part of the like research process. Carolyn is with, like when she's studying, like this drafting into the city. And what I found very interesting in Siasta Gates' project is that he brought parts of all these venues inside his own work. With the ceramic and with the marble from this place, from the plaster from the other place, and the ground or the dust or whatever, to make a form. So this is something which I found very interesting. For me it was, and this is for me, and also what happened at the press conference this morning, that he could sing, or that the artist can sing, is also a question of displacement.
We can even be pop stars, you know.
Yes, but I don't know if it's part of being a pop star. No, but I know. But I think you're working, pushing the artist to experience a kind of displacement. And when I asked Siasta this morning, is it finished? He said it will never be finished. And I think this is part also of the contradiction of being in the kind of international art event as biennales, but the artists, they just go on with their work. And so this is something I'm very interested in. So that's it. And yeah, I didn't answer the question with the text for the catalog. But yeah, I wanted to focus on a painting I like very much of Turner, and the slave ship, and throwing the dead and the dying into the sea, typhoon coming soon. And I like very much this title, which is not the title today of the painting. But I wanted to make this link of the migrants and the slavery, and the way for me, what is water or what is the sea today for me. So I think, but this is not a theme actually. This is something which is, I think, interesting, important. Even if the theme, it's not like a theme. It's not. It's better not to think the sea as a theme. Even if you can buy some salt as a memory.
On a very practical question, how did you define the geographical scope of your research when you were selecting artists?
Well, I didn't define the geographical scope. It was more a defining maybe of a historical scope, first of all. So Santiago Ramón y Cajal was immediately binding one boundary of the scope, who is the man who discovered the neuron and got the Nobel Prize for that in 1906, but he's working in the late 1800s. And I immediately wanted to bring his drawings here. And so that obviously meant that Spain was in the geography of this thing. And if you look at the Bosphorus, kind of looks like his drawings. They're in the channel. It is a synapse, no? And it is a sodium channel. You know, the neuron cells, they cannot do anything unless there is sodium channels that allow for the change of potential to occur. So if you don't have salt, slowly your fingers don't move, and then your legs don't move, and then your heart stops, and then inshallah. But if you do have a little bit of salt, it all works. And so this gap, or this phi, this gap, allows for information to be passed and to jump. So let's say that the geography was transformed into something that had to do with the history of our knowledge of the brain. And so the oldest work in the whole exhibition is this painting by Santiago Cajal that's in the channel. And oddly enough, when I went to the estate, and Juan Carlos will be speaking in one of these events one of these days, in Madrid, I realized that he had wanted to be an artist his whole life, and his father was a doctor, forced him to study medicine, and so he studied medicine and became a Nobel Prize neurologist. But his earliest work was of waves. So there you go, you know, tout se tient, and so that's the oldest painting in it. Geographically, it occurred to me immediately that I wanted to speak about the Armenian question. It's 2015, 100 years after the Armenian genocide. And symbolic, because we're really talking about a splintering off of different places from the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, and actually earlier, because Greece separates earlier, you know, earlier 1800s, and then the Balkans and Bulgaria and so on, and then Arab uprising, Arab nationalisms, and Armenian nationalism and so on. And slowly then this Ottoman Empire is falling apart, tons of meddling foreign, as is today in the whole area region. You know, there's the British meddling and the French meddling and the Germans meddling and the Russians meddling. Everybody's meddling to achieve the demise of the Ottoman Empire and so forth. And there you go with, that's not the geography, back to geography. So it occurred to me that sometimes when you cannot speak directly too much about things, you speak obliquely. And one way of speaking obliquely is through looking at the patterns and waves of similar or different but parallel events. So it occurred to me immediately that Australia would be part of this, because let's say that Aboriginal land looks a little bit like Western Armenia or Eastern Anatolia, depends on how you call it, the deserts or down towards Syria. So it occurred to me that I would speak to the Bark Petition and to the consequences of the Bark Petition.
What is that?
The Bark Petition is the first activist artwork in history, in a way. Because if we speak about an art object or an artwork that has a transformative potential and transformative agency to actually change laws, to achieve change, like practical daily life change, one of the first case I know of is the Bark Petition with an ancestor in the message sticks, which are there, south by southeast. And the Bark Petition was a paper written in English and in transliterated one of the Yolngu languages that was sent to Canberra in 1963 to ask for land rights after a certain tree had been cut down. And people from Turkey know what that means, of course, a tree, Aka, Gezi, etc. It all started with a tree. So it always all starts with a tree. That's why I like trees. Trees are very special. Boyce uses the tree. I mean, the tree is something that has a very strong political agency in itself. It silently is kind of growing and moving, but we don't notice it growing and moving. And it's ourselves, it's the anthropomorphic form par excellence in the world of so-called nature. So the bark petition was sent in 5 copies, I think, to different people. And it was placed on this bark with drawing around it. And so it's painting, but it's painting that has the knowledges of certain things of the land. And basically, to make a long story short, it initiates the land rights and therefore all the restitution and everything that happened in Australia that we know of today, which is not a perfect and ideal situation. Obviously, there's a hell of a lot of racism and a hell of a lot of problems there, but it certainly is a step in the direction. And then the saltwater paintings that were made by the same people, but many years later, they also are were used as evidence in trials and achieved the first sea rights of Aboriginal peoples in all of Australia. So until the tidal influence, the level of the. So that was one other geographical place. And then Rantink Foundation, I thought it would be interesting to invite Nguyen Hui An. It's one of the most remote venues. It's in Sicily. It's a foundation that hosts the Armenian newspaper Agos. And Rantink is the journalist who was assassinated in 2007. Around the corner in the old offices that René Gabri and Irina Nastas are living in and inhabiting and organizing events in during the Biennial. But it occurred to me that I would invite Nguyen Hui An from Hanoi because, of course, of one's association with Vietnam and certain things that happened there, but also with the temporal gap. Somehow it's not topical, like Vietnam is not topical. It's not the bombing of the Kurds right now. It's something else. It's distant in time that has gone through film and cinema and literature. So there are things that are not topical right now in this area. But what is topical and what is not topical is the question. And it occurred to me that there's a sense of waiting here. People wait. It's a funny thing. It's like a land of ghosts and people wait. And there's one of the anthologized texts chosen by one of the Turkish artists is a text about waiting. And it seems to me that Nguyen Hui An's work is also about waiting in this time after time, to use Agamben's concept of the time after time taken from the letter of St. Paul to the Romans in his book After Auschwitz. Does that answer the geographical question?
Yes, thank you.
So I wanted to ask just a question, a kind of brutally simple question. So much of what you've done here is political, is obviously tied to the political. So how do you think about, this notion of effect and change and the political? Adorno, again, when he made his famous comment about you can't write poetry after
there is no lyrical poetry. He didn't say you can't write poetry. There is no lyrical poetry.
And then he in fact changed that. He said, well, maybe you can. But how do you think about this?
Well, I agree with Adorno and I agree with his change of mind. Edward Said, let's go to Edward Said. His critique of Orientalism precedes his critique of the critique of Orientalism 20 years later. Does that answer the question?
No, not exactly.
Gosh.
Sorry.
Well, but the exhibition does answer the question. I think it really does. I mean, I don't know how to, I'm not a politician and I'm not an activist in my daily life. I don't know how to answer that question really well.
We'll let you off the hook then. Maybe we should open it up to.
Okay.
One fast question before we do open it up. Biennales are nomadic entities, and they appear and then they disappear. how do we build audiences for them, do you think? Because we've got, you know, a hardcore of aficionados, and we travel and we're here, and there's a very growing art community, but how do you reach, or what methods have you used to reach the uninitiated audience, the sort of people living on the edge of
That's
Istanbul?
very important.
In
That's
Turkey?
very important. Well, that's very important. I actually never think about the globe-trotting Biennale audience, and I don't really think about increasing that. I mean, whoever wants to come, comes, and who doesn't want to come, doesn't come. And generally, it's privileged people who can come, or people who get a grant, you know, from their university and can come. So I don't really worry about them, and I don't think so much about them. But I do think about welcoming them. I mean, I do have a really good friends and patrons organization. I hope that people are happy with it.
Yeah.
So, and the press are all taken care of and all that. But what you're really asking is about the so-called local audience.
Yeah.
The so-called local audience is not local, of course, because we live in a place that is totally people from all over the world are in, whether they want to or whether they're forced to, they're hanging around in Istanbul and in the region. I think that the main thing that I did is a question of access. To go back to Sydney, nobody had been inside the Sydney Opera House except for the privileged who had bought tickets or who buy the $25 guided tour or whatever it is. I don't know the price. But the city of Sydney had never had access in a free way. The night of the Biennial project, when the tropical forest was put inside the Sydney Opera House, doors were open and there were lines for kilometers outside all night. You know, it was so beautiful to see the people of Sydney go through that space and see the Sydney Opera House for the first time for free. So it's about access. We have, you know, organized extra ferries that go up to Rumeli Feneri. A lot of people have never seen the Black Sea, you know. A lot of people, they live in Bidonville or they don't have the time, they've never seen the Black Sea. Maybe they've never been to Buykada. You know, Buykada is a place, it's a kind of bourgeois resort place now. Of course, it was exile for Trotsky. But I think it shows to the people of Istanbul also what the architecture looked like, because there's so little of this wooden architecture left in Istanbul because of gentrification. It's been all torn down and all these new buildings. So I think in providing that access with more ferries and also some free ferries during certain periods. Sivriada, nobody has been to the island where 70,000 dogs were brought and massacred, you know. That's not possible unless you have a private boat. So people go when they go swimming on their private boats. So now once a week we have this free boat that goes from Buykada to Sivriada, which is the location of the Biennial project. So in this sense, I would say it's not so much a question, I mean, in terms of the local audience, it is about the transformative powers of art and bringing more and more people close to art through different education programs, navigators and guided tours and all that stuff. That's part of it. But it's also about opening up spaces to the people of a place that are not accessible normally. Oh, this means time's up.
Okay. Questions or comments from the floor, please?
Yes.
Why don't you reveal any details about the exhibition?
That's not true. That's not correct. We had several press releases out, and I revealed the names of a number of artists participating by calling them alliances, such as Cevdet Erek.
Well, detailed information.
Because we live in an information era, and in an age of global financial capitalism and knowledge capitalism, where knowledge and information seems to be some sort of golden product that is going to give power to people or not give power to people. And I wanted to flatten that in a way and avoid the whole situation of information, just to to not allow that information be detached from formation. I believe that information should be transformed again back into formation. So I think that we live in an internet age where there is a huge lie. There is a lie. The lie is that we have access to everything, that we can Google everything, that we can Wikipedia everything, that we can go online and find out what's in the Istanbul Biennial. That's a lie. It's a lie. We can only have formation. And education is formation. I come from arte povera. No one must ever forget that. My teachers are people who believed that there is no detachment between mind and body. There cannot be information without formation. There cannot be mind without body. That's my answer. So I know that it creates a bit of stress with the press, but I think it only creates stress with the press. I don't think it creates stress with anybody else. I think everybody's fine with it and cool with it. You know, I just don't want to know the biography of the person I'm going to go have dinner with. I'm not interested in that. If someone says, come over, there's going to be a nice dinner at my house, you know, people are bringing potluck, and we're also inviting your friend Kathy and Mary and Jane. You feel comfortable enough because you've heard that Kathy and Mary and Jane are there, and then you go to the dinner. You don't say, I would like to know the list of everybody who's invited before I decide if it's worth my time to go see that, go have a dinner with these people. What a horrible way to marry. I'm sorry to say that, and I know that it will create problems, and it may, you know, you might be very upset, and you may be a member of the press, but I'm sorry to create that problem for the press, but I think that the world is much larger than the press. That's my answer.
May I take
Yes.
any more questions, comments?
Okay. That's all, folks. Enjoy the exhibition. And there's detailed information in the guidebook, this map, on the website and in the catalog.
On the website, you can find it.
I'm sorry to create that problem for the press, but I think that the world is much larger than the press. That's my answer.
May I take
Yes.
any more questions, comments?
It's okay. Okay. That's all, folks. Enjoy the exhibition. And there's detailed information in the guidebook, this map, on the website and in the catalog.
On the website, you can find it.